The Pacific sky burned with the color of dying daylight. It was late 1944. The war had entered its most unforgiving rhythm. Far below, the blue expanse of the Philippine Sea shimmered like molten glass, scarred with drifting oil slicks and floating debris from the day's battles. On a small stretch of coastline occupied by Imperial Japanese forces, a group of officers stood beside their field glasses, scanning the horizon for returning aircraft. The air still trembled from the echoes of gunfire and engines. Then, a single shape emerged from the clouds. A lone American fighter, smoke trailing from its fuselage, spiraled downward in a controlled descent. The aircraft's wings were riddled with holes. Its propeller coughed in protest. Yet the pilot did not eject. Through binoculars, one Japanese officer saw him straighten his flight path, lift his gloved hand toward the rising sun, and salute. It was not defiance. It was acknowledgement of skill, of mortality, of shared duty in the endless sky. Seconds later, the fighter struck the sea and vanished in a white bloom of spray. The shoreline fell silent. Even war for that brief moment seemed to pause. By 1944, the Pacific War had entered a decisive and merciless phase. The once invincible Imperial Japanese Navy was retreating, island by island, under the relentless advance of the United States and its allies. The war that had begun with Japan's surprise at Pearl Harbor was now being reversed through the grinding strategy of attrition. Fought in jungles, on coral atolls, and high above the sea in duels of speed, fire, and endurance. Air superiority had become the defining element of power in the Pacific. The Japanese Zero fighter, a symbol of early war dominance, was no longer untouchable. Its unmatched agility and range, which had humiliated Allied pilots in 1941 and 1942, were now countered by newer American aircraft, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Chance-Vought F-4U Corsair. Both were faster, tougher, and far more forgiving under fire. The tide of war had shifted not only in technology, but in the experience of men. Japan's elite pilots and the ones who had mastered the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Coral Sea, and Guadalcanal were nearly gone. Years of unrelenting combat and an inadequate training pipeline had thinned their ranks beyond recovery. By mid-1944, Japan was sending young aviators into the air with barely 100 hours of flight time, often with no combat experience at all. Across the Pacific, the United States was doing the opposite. Its industrial and logistical might had matured into a war machine of staggering efficiency. American pilots trained longer, flew safer, and were supported by radar-guided operations, advanced carrier coordination, and a deep understanding of the enemy's methods. What Japan once achieved through skill and audacity, America now accomplished through discipline and overwhelming precision. But war in the air was never just mechanical. Even at 20,000 feet, it was deeply human, a contest of nerve, reflex, and moral endurance. The Pacific sky was vast, but inside a cockpit barely wider than a man's shoulders, every second could mean life or death. Pilots learned to read the sun's position, the shimmer of metal, the black flash of tracer fire. They learned to feel their machines as extensions of their own bodies. The Japanese code of Bushido, the way of the warrior, defined their mindset. For the airmen of the Imperial Navy, honor was not a word. It was oxygen. To die in combat was the highest form of service. To fall in battle was to preserve dignity. This spirit had carried Japanese aviators through impossible odds. But by 1944, it had also chained them to a war they could no longer win. American pilots, meanwhile, came from a culture that valued courage but not ritual sacrifice. Their goal was victory, to survive, fight again, and bring each other home. Yet even among them, respect for the enemy was common. Veterans spoke of Japanese flyers as fearless, precise, and utterly determined. Encounters often left both sides in silent recognition of shared skill and fate. As the front moved closer to Japan's home islands, every sortie became more desperate. Every engagement was fought not only for territory but for pride, a struggle of nations, technologies, and philosophies of war. It was within this crucible, above the Philippine Sea, that a lone American pilot would face his final moment. And in that instant, turn destruction into dignity. The stage was set for one of the most human gestures ever recorded amid the chaos of the Pacific sky. a salute that neither side would forget. In the skies over the Pacific, the Americans were flying the most advanced naval aircraft ever built to that date. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, born from the lessons of early defeats, had become the empire breaker. It was fast, heavily armed, and famously rugged. Pilots called it the Ace Maker, for it turned raw recruits into seasoned veterans in a matter of weeks. Its .650 caliber Browning machine guns could tear through an enemy aircraft in seconds. By mid-1944, U.S. carriers like the Enterprise, Lexington, and Essex formed vast floating airfields that projected American air power thousands of miles from home. The Hellcat and later the F-4U Corsair were their wings, a direct challenge to the Zero's myth of invincibility. American flyers no longer feared the Japanese pilot. They respected him, but they knew the numbers, and the war, were on their side. The transformation of the U.S. Navy's air arm was not just mechanical, it was cultural. Pilot training had evolved into a precise science. Young men from Texas, Ohio, or California trained in the blistering sun of Florida and Arizona. They studied tactics, formations, and gunnery under veterans of the early Pacific campaigns. They were taught to think as a team, to protect one another, and to outlast the enemy. To an American pilot, victory meant survival, to fight, to win, and to return home. Yet beneath the mechanical efficiency and tactical doctrine, there was a human heartbeat, a sense of duty that could not be quantified. These were men who had grown up watching biplanes and barnstormers, now flying machines capable of crossing oceans. They were young, often no older than 21, but carried the weight of nations on their shoulders. Across the ocean, Japan's Air Force was still fighting with fierce determination but under impossible strain. Fuel shortages, declining pilot quality, and the overwhelming scale of Allied industry had turned many missions into one-way journeys. In some cases, the line between duty and suicide blurred. The seeds of the kamikaze were already being sown, not as fanaticism, but as desperation wrapped in honor. This was the world of contrasts, the American code of survival versus the Japanese code of sacrifice. The industrial age versus the warrior age. Both collided daily over the endless Pacific, and in between them fleeting moments of recognition emerged. Moments that defied propaganda and hatred. Reports from both sides told of pilots who broke formation to avoid killing a crippled opponent, or who later dropped flowers over enemy crash sites. Though rare, these gestures were real, silent acknowledgments of courage. To salute an enemy, especially in mid-battle, was an act both reckless and profound. It spoke of a fraternity only those who fought in the sky could truly understand. By 1944, such moments carried an even heavier meaning. The war had consumed millions of lives. Civilians burned in cities, fleets sank by the dozens, and nations trembled under the weight of total conflict. Yet even as strategy and ideology hardened men into weapons, humanity sometimes forced its way through the smoke, an instinct older than war itself. In the weeks leading to the fateful encounter, American raids intensified across the Philippines. Carrier task forces launched waves of bombers and fighters daily. Japanese bases, desperate and short of replacements, responded with what remained of their air wings. Among the surviving officers were men who had trained under the legendary aces of 1942, their pride undiminished even as defeat loomed. It was in this environment of exhaustion, courage, and crumbling empires that one brief exchange of salutes would leave even seasoned warriors speechless. The Japanese officers who watched it unfold would later describe it not as a gesture of arrogance, but of honor, a dying pilot's acknowledgement that they had fought well, and that he too had given everything. The stage was now fully set, the Pacific skies ready for Mo. One of the most haunting and unforgettable encounters of the air. War Duane is one. The human angle, for the men who fought. The air war over the Pacific. Life was measured not in years, but in missions. A single sortie could decide everything. A flash of gunfire, a turn too late, a cloud in the wrong place. The pilots lived in cycles of exhaustion and adrenaline, alternating between laughter on the carrier deck and silence in the ready room. Every dawn brought new faces, and often by dusk, empty bunks. American flyers spoke of the smell of the sea that mixed with aviation fuel and cordite. Japanese pilots described the scent of cherry blossoms, a symbol of fleeting life, before they took off. Though oceans and cultures divided them, They shared a quiet fatalism. Each knew he might never return. The American pilot's courage came from discipline and training, the belief that skill and teamwork could overcome danger. For the Japanese airmen, courage was intertwined with destiny. They believed that death in service of the emperor preserved the purity of their spirit. In that belief there was serenity, not despair. When these two worlds collided in the skies, there was no hatred in the moment of combat, only focus. The men who survived spoke later of how, in that split second of closing distance, they saw the enemy's face, not a monster, not prop. Long pauses, sentences that trailed off into silence. They understood that only those who had flown could truly comprehend the paradox of aerial combat, the loneliness of the sky, and the strange intimacy of death within it. It was in this crucible of emotion that gestures of respect and like a mid-air salute emerged. They were not acts of weakness but of strength. To salute an enemy was to see him as an equal, even for an instant, before the war consumed them both. The tactical angle, the Pacific Air War, was a test not just of men but of machines, of how far human reflexes could be pushed by the physics of flight. The Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0 was a masterpiece of lightweight design. With unmatched agility, it could turn tighter than any Allied fighter in 1941 or 1942. But its strength was also its weakness. It lacked armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and could ignite with a single hit. By contrast, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat was heavy, armored, and brutally effective. It could dive faster, absorb punishment, and still bring its pilot home. Where the Zero demanded elegance, the Hellcat demanded power. Their encounters were like duels between a swordsman and a hammer-wielding titan. Tactically, American doctrine evolved from bitter experience. In 1942, U.S. pilots learned the hard way that trying to outturn a Zero was suicide. Instead, they developed the boom and zoom strategy, diving from altitude, firing, and climbing away before the lighter Japanese fighter could respond. It was science against instinct, engineering against artistry. The Japanese relied on formation discipline, often flying in the V pattern, with mutual protection from rear attacks. But by 1944, radio coordination, radar support, and overwhelming numbers gave the Americans a decisive edge. The battlefield of the sky had become data-driven. Still, the tactical struggle remained intensely personal. Dogfights often unfolded at point-blank range, where closing speeds exceeded 600 miles per hour. The difference between survival and death could be a single second's delay or a cloud's shadow at the wrong time. Pilots learned to trust intuition. They could feel when an enemy was closing in, not by sight but by the rhythm of the fight, the faint shimmer in the sun's glare, or the staccato vibration of tracers passing too close. In that environment, instinct became almost spiritual, and it was often in those last desperate moments, when fuel ran low, control surfaces failed, and escape was impossible, that clarity came. When all options vanished, what remained was honor. For a pilot spiraling toward the sea, raising a gloved hand in salute was not madness. It was purpose. It was saying, "I did not fear you. I fought you well. I accept the end." For the Japanese officers who witnessed such a gesture, it struck deeply. The Bushido Code recognized valor wherever it appeared. To salute even as an enemy fell was to acknowledge that courage transcended nation or cause. Thus, the tactical reality of air combat, brutal, calculated, mechanical, often ended in moments that were profoundly human. Amid the noise of engines and gunfire, an unspoken truth hovered. Even warriors could recognize grace. The cultural angle, to understand the meaning of that single salute, one must first understand the collision of two civilizations that shaped it. The United States fought a modern industrial war, a conflict of logistics, machines, and mass production. Japan fought a spiritual one, a continuation of its ancient warrior ethos adapted to the sky. For the Japanese pilot, the cockpit was a shrine. Before takeoff, many touched small Shinto charms tied to their flight suits. Ofuda for protection, or letters from home sealed within fabric. They were told that the spirit of Yamato, the essence of Japan itself, lived within them. To die for the emperor was not tragedy. It was fulfillment. The Americans, raised on democracy and pragmatism, approached war differently. Their courage came not from divine order, but from duty, brotherhood, and belief in returning home. Where the Japanese saw beauty in self-sacrifice, Americans saw purpose in survival. Both fought fiercely, but for entirely different meanings of honor, and yet in the air those distinctions blurred. At 15,000 feet, stripped of politics and ceremony, courage looked the same. The Japanese ace who dove into enemy formations with impossible calm was not so different from the American pilot who refused to bail out of his burning aircraft until his wingman escaped. Both embodied the same raw defiance of fear. That was why the salute meant so much. When the American raised his hand in his final seconds, it was not a gesture of allegiance. It was communication in the only language the two sides shared: respect. It acknowledged that beneath all ideology, the warrior's code was universal. Among Japanese officers, that gesture would later be remembered not as humiliation, but as proof that even enemies could be bound by the same invisible thread: the will to face death with dignity. In their diaries, some referred to such foes as rival souls, not adversaries. The moral angle: by 1944, the Pacific War had become a conflict without mercy. Entire cities burned. Prisoners were executed. Civilians starved under occupation and bombardment. The humanity that once restrained war seemed to dissolve into fire and vengeance. Yet even then, fragments of morality survived, often where no one expected them to. The air war was both impersonal and intimate. From thousands of feet above, bombers erased cities, but in the dogfights where a man saw the face of another before pulling the trigger, morality could still intrude. Some pilots later admitted they hesitated, not from fear but from recognition. "He looked just like me," one Hellcat pilot wrote after the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Such thoughts rarely lasted long. Training suppressed them. Survival demanded focus. But every once in a while, those moments broke through. The salute, seen by the Japanese officers below, was one such fracture in the machinery of war. It was the instant when a man, knowing death was inevitable, chose not hatred, not despair, but acknowledgement. It was moral clarity expressed through motion. For the observers, the gesture was disarming. They had watched countless enemies fall, but never one who greeted them before dying. In that second, the faceless enemy became a person, one who fought by his own code and died by it. Some historians later questioned whether such moments mattered in a war of annihilation. But the truth is that they mattered precisely because they were rare. In total war, humanity becomes the most valuable resource of all. The Japanese had their own traditions of farewell. Pilots embarking on near-suicidal missions often wrote senjinkun, small farewell notes left behind for family, expressing pride and peace with their fate. The American pilot's salute mirrored that sentiment, but in reverse, it was not written on paper, but performed in the air, witnessed by those he had fought. It did not alter strategy nor change the course of the war. But to those who saw it, it lingered, proof that honor could survive even the world's darkest hours. A salute in any culture is an act of recognition. It affirms existence. I see you and I respect what you represent. In war, it carries deeper weight. Between enemies, it becomes something transcendent, a brief rebellion against the chaos around them. In the case of the Pacific War, that gesture bridged two conceptions of death. For the Japanese, death was release, the final act of loyalty. For the American, it was loss and the end of service, the price of freedom. Yet both required courage beyond measure. When the dying pilot lifted his hand toward the officers who moments before had been his enemies, he redefined that sky. He turned his fall into a message that even in destruction, grace was possible. The Japanese officers, trained to accept death as honor, recognized it immediately. One reportedly lowered his head, not in victory but in respect. Such acts are often forgotten in the statistics of war. Historians focus on sorties, losses, and tonnage. But the soul of the war, its moral temperature, is found in fleeting gestures like that. They reveal that courage is not bound by uniform, and that even in humanity's most destructive moments, understanding can flicker like a light through smoke. In the years that followed, similar stories emerged from both sides, of pilots who escorted crippled bombers out of enemy territory, of crews who saluted each other before parting ways forever. These were not legends. They were the last remnants of a code older than the machines themselves, and it is within that code, unspoken yet universal, that the story of the American pilot's salute truly belongs. It was not about surrender or defiance, but reconciliation with fate. It was October 25, 1944, the second day of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval confrontation in human history. Over the waters east of the Philippines, the air vibrated with the continuous hum of engines. Hundreds of aircraft crisscrossed the skies above a sea littered with burning ships and drifting lifeboats. From the deck of the carrier USS Lexington, Lieutenant Harold Dixon, 23 years old, a Hellcat pilot from Kansas, was among those launched before sunrise. His squadron, VF-15, had been tasked with striking Japanese positions near the Sibuyan Sea, where remnants of the Imperial Navy's Central Force were retreating after a brutal exchange.
Their orders were clear: locate enemy fighters, disrupt airfields, and protect the advancing fleet. But in war, clarity rarely survived first contact. Within minutes of reaching altitude, Dixon's formation encountered a dozen Mitsubishi A6M50 fighters sweeping down from clouds. The engagement was instantaneous. Chaos shaped by precision. Machine guns roared. Tracers streaked through the dawn like fiery threads. The Hellcats dove first, using their superior speed to break the enemy's altitude advantage. Dixon locked onto 1-0, fired a short burst, and saw the aircraft erupt in flame, its pilot bailing out moments before it vanished below the clouds. Then, from his left, two more Zeros converged on him in a perfect scissors maneuver. He pulled hard, rolling inverted dive through a curtain of bullets. His Hellcat shuddered, but held. The Americans had learned never to turn with a Zero, always to dive, always to use gravity as their ally. He throttled down, looped back, and emerged behind one of his attackers, firing until pieces of the enemy's wing tore free. But the second Zero was already on his tail. At 400 knots, Dixon's cockpit filled with the metallic whine of his striking armor. Oil sprayed across the windshield. Instruments flickered. The engine coughed once, then again, a sputtering death rattle. He was hit, losing altitude fast. Over the radio, his wingman's voice crackled through static. "Dix, pull out." Then silence. He looked down. Below him stretched the coastline of Luzon, jagged cliffs, a scattering of trees, and a narrow stretch of beach where a Japanese observation post stood. Through the smoke trailing from his engine, he could see tiny figures running toward the shore, binoculars glinting in the sun. Inside the failing Hellcat, Dixon's options were gone. The ejection seat had jammed from shrapnel damage. The cockpit canopy, cracked but intact, refused to slide back. Fuel was leaking into the fuselage. He knew what came next, not panic, but resolve. Pilots had been trained for this moment from their first day. If you can't land, go down with control. He steadied the aircraft, leveling its wings despite the vibration tearing through the frame. For a moment, the world became still. The sound of wind over the canopy, the distant flash of gunfire, the shimmering horizon. He looked toward the ground, toward the officers staring back through their lenses. Perhaps he saw them clearly. Perhaps he only sensed their presence. What he did next was instinct, the reflex of a man who had lived by discipline, who had learned that even death demanded order. He raised his right hand from the throttle, straightened his wrist, and saluted. From below, the Japanese officers froze. Through their binoculars, they watched the descending aircraft tilt slightly, as if guided by invisible purpose. Smoke curled around it like a black ribbon. The pilot's silhouette was motionless, hand raised, until sea rushed up and swallowed everything in a burst of white spray. No one spoke. For several seconds, the officers simply watched the waves close over the wreck. Then one, an older lieutenant commander named Takeshi Iwamura, slowly lowered his binoculars. "He saluted," he murmured. The others nodded, not in disbelief, but in understanding. Reports from that observation post would later reach local command. Among the terse lines of coordinates and sightings, one stood out in Iwamura's handwriting. Enemy pilot, mortally damaged, descended under control, raised hand in salute before impact. A brave and honorable adversary. The note would survive the war. For the men who witnessed it, the gesture defied all logic. It was not surrender. It was something higher, the acknowledgement of equality and courage, the the wordless farewell between two sides of the same profession. Above the wreckage, the Pacific wind continued to howl, carried with the faint smell of burning oil and salt. The battle raged on elsewhere, but for those who saw that moment, the war briefly stopped. The crash site burned for hours. From a Japanese observation post, black smoke drifted over the coastline, curling into the humid sky like a morning flag. The officers watched in silence. No celebration followed. Only the soft murmur of waves against the shore and the distant rumble of engines above. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Iwamura, the senior officer present, kept his gaze fixed on the smoke column. He had been a naval aviator once, before being reassigned to ground command after injury. He knew what it meant to die in the cockpit. The quiet resolve, the refusal to surrender to chaos. He turned to his men and said, almost as if speaking to himself, "That man was a warrior." Nearby, other Japanese troops gathered, drawn by the sight. They expected their commander to order a search or recovery of enemy remains, but none came. The beach was still within range of Allied fighters. The wreckage lay far beyond safe reach. Instead, Iwamura ordered a simple gesture, a small white flag placed in the sand, facing the sea. It was not surrender, it was respect. For a moment, the Pacific War, a conflict defined by total destruction, paused to acknowledge the humanity of one man. But the wider world did not pause. Above them, the Battle of Leyte Gulf raged toward its final crescendo. Hundreds of aircraft filled the sky as Japan's last major naval effort disintegrated under the combined firepower of the U.S. Navy's Task Force 38. Admiral William Halsey's carriers unleashed wave after wave of strikes. American pilots, many no older than the man who had just perished, attacked with machine-like precision. Torpedoes, bombs, rockets, their missions blurring into exhaustion and smoke. To the Japanese fleet below, it was the death of an empire at sea. The Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, was still afloat but helpless. The once unstoppable carrier groups of Japan had been reduced to decoys, stripped of planes and pilots. Fuel shortages grounded many squadrons before they could even take off. And yet, amid this vast machinery of war, the memory of that lone salute began to circulate quietly among officers stationed along the coast. By evening, a runner carried Iwamura's written account to divisional headquarters. There, a staff officer read it aloud before setting it aside, muttering, "Strange. Even enemies have honor." It was rare for such reports to survive the bureaucratic process of war, but this one did, perhaps because it spoke to something deeper than strategy. It reminded men hardened by years of killing that valor could still exist without victory. That night, under blackout conditions, Iwamura stood outside his bunker and looked toward the dark horizon. The air was still heavy with smoke and salt. In the distance, faint flashes marked where the fleets continued their deadly ballet. He thought of the American pilot, of what might have compelled him to salute. Was it discipline, defiance, or simply the reflex of a soldier acknowledging another? To the Japanese mind, rooted in Bushido, such a gesture resonated deeply. The code taught that one's final act must reflect one's soul, composed, fearless, unwavering. In that sense, the pilot's salute was perfect. It carried no fear, no bitterness, only acknowledgement of a shared truth, that death in duty erases enmity. For Iwamura, it was not a victory to record, but a lesson to remember. While the battle raged at sea, American pilots returning to their carriers would later report the loss of Lieutenant Dixon. He was listed as missing in action, presumed killed. His wingman, who had seen the initial engagement but not the final descent, later recalled, "He stayed in control longer than anyone I've ever seen. He wouldn't let go of that stick." In the ready room, his absence was noted quietly. No speeches, no ceremony, just the empty chair, the unclaimed flight helmet, and the understanding shared by all who flew. For the Americans aboard the Lexington, the war moved on within hours. New missions were assigned, new names filled the rosters. But somewhere, perhaps in silence before takeoff, a few remembered the pilot who never returned, the one whose final act was not surrender, but respect. As the sun rose the following morning, the Pacific was littered with oil slicks and wreckage. The air stank of fuel and burnt metal. Japanese units withdrew inland, retreating from Allied bombardment. Before leaving the post, Iwamura gave one final order. The white flag in the sand was to remain. He said only, "Let the sea decide what to do with it." When American forces landed in that area weeks later, they found little left. Fragments of wreckage, rusted metal, and, half buried in the sand, a tattered piece of cloth still fluttering in the wind. The soldiers assumed it was a surrender marker and paid it no mind. They could not have known it had been placed there as a tribute to one of their own. In the grand scale of the Pacific War, the story barely existed. A footnote to a battle that consumed thousands of lives. Yet those who saw it carried it silently through the years that followed. When Japan finally surrendered in August 1945, and officers like Iwamura were disarmed and questioned, fragments of such memories surfaced in conversation. One American intelligence officer later noted in his report, several Japanese personnel referenced isolated acts of American valor that they regarded with genuine admiration. In one instance, an officer described a downed U.S. pilot who saluted before crashing. The officer's tone was not derisive, but reverent. The story had survived, quietly, like a whisper carried on the ocean wind. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended with catastrophic losses for Japan. For carriers, 3 battleships, and over 400 aircraft destroyed. It was a turning point that sealed the empire's fate. But amid the statistics and strategy, the legend of a single salute endured, an echo of mutual respect in a war otherwise devoid of mercy. And from that day on, among the few Japanese survivors who had seen it, there persisted a belief that courage, when pure, needed no flag or anthem, only recognition. By the end of 1944, the Pacific had become an open graveyard of ships and ambitions. The Battle of Leyte Gulf had torn apart Japan's remaining naval power, leaving its islands vulnerable to direct assault. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of Asia, was no longer capable of defending the empire it had built through decades of conquest. But amid this vast collapse, smaller human stories lingered, half buried beneath the weight of history. The salute of a single American pilot, witnessed by a handful of Japanese officers on a quiet stretch of coast, was one of them. When U.S. forces began retaking the Philippines in full, scattered reports from both sides occasionally mentioned such incidents, moments of strange mutual recognition between enemies. Some were dismissed as rumor, others as misinterpreted gestures. Yet in debriefings conducted after Japan's surrender, several captured officers spoke independently of American airmen who saluted before crashing into the sea. Their accounts differed in detail but aligned in tone, not boastful, not exaggerated, always solemn. Historians now believe this incident occurred on October 25, 1944, near the closing stages of Leyte Gulf. The timing matches the disappearance of Lieutenant Charles E. Dixon, a pilot from Fighter Squadron 19 aboard USS Lexington. His F-6F Hellcat failed to return after engaging a group of Japanese Ki-43 Oscars. His remains were never recovered. Officially, Dixon was listed as missing in action. His family received a telegram in November. His mother, in a letter preserved by the U.S. Naval Historical Center, wrote, "He was raised to respect those who fought, no matter the flag. I believe he died as he lived, with grace." It was a quiet statement, but one that reflected an enduring code among aviators. In post-war Japan, the story took on a life of its own, passed quietly among former officers and veterans groups. To them, it symbolized a rare bridge between enemies who had come to understand each other through the shared terror of flight and the shared burden of duty. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Iwamura, who survived the war and later became a school instructor in Kanagawa Prefecture, was asked in a 1952 interview what memory from the war stayed with him most vividly. He answered simply, "The salute. It was over in a breath, yet it reminded me that our enemies were men of spirit, not demons, as we were told." His words reflected a larger transformation taking root in post-war Japan, a slow rehumanization of the enemy. For years, Japanese propaganda had portrayed Allied soldiers as beasts without honor. But as veterans returned and shared what they had truly seen, the myth began to dissolve.